Hello, I'm Rosie Cooper and I'm head of exhibitions at the Rosie Cooper and I'm head of exhibitions at the Delaware Pavilion. And I'm really delighted to introduce this conversation between artist Holly Hendry and clinician educationalist Roger Kneebone. And it's taking place on the occasion of Holly Hendry's two projects at the Delaware Pavilion, a solo exhibition titled Indifferent Deep and a major outdoor commission, Invertebrate, that's part of Waterfronts, an outdoor exhibition as part of England's Creative Coast that sees 7 arts organisations in towns along the coastline of Essex, Kent and East Sussex joining forces to showcase new outdoor site-specific commissions. You can read more about Holly Hendry and Roger Kneebone in the bios below on this site. And both Holly and Roger are deeply invested in having conversations outside of their respective fields of art and science. And they both believe, as I do too, that there are significant, invaluable connections between these different specialisms. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I just wanted to mention that there's a storm outside and we're all having various different problems with Wi-Fi and technology. So while this is a pre-recorded conversation that will have editing, if there are jumps and starts in it, please bear with us. I know you're probably all used to it by now, but I just wanted to mention that. So Roger and Holly, thanks so much for being part of this. And I just wanted to start us off by asking you, Holly, why you wanted to invite Roger to have a conversation with you on the occasion of your exhibition and commission.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to have Roger here today speaking with me because it's also worth saying that we've never met in real life. We've not met before, but I've heard about his work through various sources and through various talks. And I guess it's started from a really basic kind of point of view of my kind of interest in continual research or exploration in this idea of where the body ends and begins, especially with this show, the kind of references to science, medicine, x-rays, diagrams, internals, broken things, and how this is kind of interconnected really with like the way we live and exist in terms of like architecture, space, and just our surroundings. And so that interconnectedness was a really key starting point for me. And Roger seems like he is like the most obvious and kind of amazing research around this relationship between kind of different specialisms or different approaches, and that kind of that conversation on kind of sometimes unexpected conversation between science and arts. And I think especially now today we're having this conversation just when last week it was announced that there's been 50% cuts to arts education, when Gavin Williamson was saying that is due to one of the reasons is because the kind of focus to more STEM subjects such as science and maths, and this approach to kind of, you know, dividing it. And I don't see it as a division, I see it as a connection. And I think me and Roger are both also working at universities, you know, where we see these connections and amazing conversations happen a lot. So for me, it felt relevant to kind of, you know, try and make visible some of these conversations, and an exciting point. Sorry, that's a bit of a ramble. There's a lot of reasons, right? I think it was relevant, but yeah, I think that was the starting point, really. I wonder if you, Roger, you have anything? Yeah, I don't know if that feels relevant to you.
Yes, I'd like to echo your thoughts and say thank you for inviting me to this conversation and for talking about your work, but also some of these wider issues. So my own background is a medical background. Trained first of all as a surgeon, then was a GP for a long time, and then for a number of years I've been an academic at a big London university, Imperial College London, surrounded on many sides by clinicians and by scientists. And I think there is actually a very sort of dangerous tendency these days to, as you were alluding to separate art and science. And more as I've been thinking about the nature of, first of all, clinical practice, surgical practice in my case, and then as a GP, different kinds of clinical practice. But working with my colleagues at Imperial, looking at science and engineering too, it seems to me that it is really just not possible to separate art and science, because scientific practice and clinical practice is made up of a number of elements, and one of those elements, of course, is factual knowledge. Another is specific skills, perhaps of doing experiments or operations or whatever. But all of those need to come together in a way that integrates them. And so over the last few years, I've been spending a lot of time looking, for example, at clinical practices in terms not so much of their scientific content, although that needs to be there, of course, but looking at them as sites of craftsmanship and artistry, and also of performance. And when you look at these areas like science and medicine through the lens of performance or craftsmanship, you see all kinds of things that you can often overlook, I think, if you see them in terms of factual knowledge and data and things. And although all those things are a perfectly legitimate and in fact essential way of looking at those worlds, they're not the only way. And I think one of the problems with what you were saying earlier, this artificial division, which also implies that science is worthwhile and generates new knowledge and solves social problems and creates money and things, whereas art is sort of it's optional and it doesn't really matter and it's a bit of a luxury. I think this sort of implicit hierarchy is really, really dangerous, because it implies that you have to declare for one or the other, whereas in fact I think anything you do that is worthwhile consists of both, or all those elements, and integrating those elements is the crucial thing, rather than separating them out and discarding some of them. And so this talk about not valuing the visual and the performing arts within science and engineering makes me very angry, because I think it's completely misplaced. It's very dangerous, and it runs the risk of an artificial separation that simply doesn't acknowledge the crucial importance of those ways of thinking that are rooted in the arts alongside the sciences.
Yeah, no, that's completely right, and completely terrifying.
Yeah, I really echo your sentiments too. And I think that, for me, cultural spaces are some of the really important places to cultivate the imagination. And when you go into Holly's show, it's so clear that there is a total interconnectedness between the arts and the sciences. And Roger, I wonder if I could just invite you to speak a little bit about your responses to Holly's exhibition, because I know you visited it last weekend. So I'd love to invite you to speak a little bit about your...
Yes, thank you. It was a fascinating experience. I hadn't seen Holly's work before. I'd seen a little video clip where she talked about it, but I went to the exhibition at the De La Warr Pavilion with my wife, and as I said, I've got a medical background. My wife has a number of backgrounds, one of which is as a geologist in her first career. Then she became an art historian, and now she makes hats. And so she has a range of different perspectives, and we were able to share those as we were going around and look at our different responses. And I thought that was particularly interesting, because the way I read particularly the internal part of the exhibition, but also the external part as well, the invertebrate, was to see things in terms of processes, and I noticed the sort of medical resonances, I suppose. So when I saw things with curvy boundaries, tubes, I sort of saw those in terms of the structures I'd seen in the operating theatre, of intestines, and then I started seeing representations, I think, of things changing, of transformations, of systems or collections of observations that, to me, pointed out a process of continual change. And so that process of continual change, which you might think of in a medical sense as a process of digestion, of taking stuff in and then transforming it to something else, and then waste products being got rid of at the end, and then things going around in a circular process. I sort of responded to those, which through Holly's eyes I saw in terms of the inanimate world as well, of rock and sand and fossils and bricks and all sorts of things that I'm sure Holly will explain in a minute from her point of view. But I saw these things in terms of cycles and processes, which for me were biological, physiological, and very human. For my wife, on the other hand, she saw them also in terms of processes, but because her background includes being a geologist, she saw them in terms of geological processes and hydrological processes, and what was happening with relationships between the ocean and the environment, or between large-scale, very slow geological processes. And it made me think that what is salient and what you notice very often depends on the speed at which things are happening and the speed at which you're noticing them. And to me, some of the works, Holly, that you were where you were involving the brick factory and the sort of involvement of materials and turning them into other things, to me brought out some of those issues around speed and sort of the length of time and these sort of continual processes, which to me were fascinating, and the many different works within that space meant that it was possible, I found, to sort of go from one to the other and build up a composite picture of what things looked like on the inside of a space, almost like the inside of a body, and then going outside and seeing a very different work out in the open air, and a different sense of scale, obviously much smaller in comparison with the big wide open world there, as opposed to the more constrained space inside the gallery. All these things seem to me to be opening up different ways of thinking about relationships.
Well, I'm just writing down lots of words here because I keep thinking things that I want to respond to you, and now I've got a big list. But it's such a interesting, and it's really great to hear that from you as well, because obviously in these times we're in, I haven't had maybe some of the similar opportunities to talk with people about the show in a way that you normally would. But one thing that definitely came to mind that you said was speed, and that's something that I think I've almost realized and thought about more after having seen the show all together and having it as one instead of kind of parts all over my studio. And this idea of kind of speed is, I think a lot of the time with a lot of the ideas, I was thinking about this idea of a kind of slow emergency, and that seems like it doesn't make sense, but in relation to, you know, medicine or geology or the Anthropocene or, you know, galleries or education, all these things feel like these kind of slow anxiety, slow apocalypse, these things that are like they're kind of appearing before your eyes, and they're terrible things that feel like sometimes the end of something. But it's like what is a slow emergency? What is how do we deal with that as well? Because it's not something that just one day changes, it's something we're kind of gradually seeing. And that definitely also relates to, you know, my thinking around the site as well, of being on the kind of edge of the land and seeing erosion, seeing yellow smog of pollution on days as well. And that kind of, you know, it kind of becomes normal as well. It kind of becomes part of an everyday. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is how you were talking about, you know, how your influence and your lived experience affects your reading of the work as well. And we both having partners. My partner, his first day of being a junior doctor was this Wednesday, and so he's kind of got this connection with medicine, and your partner's got this kind of creative connection, and obviously that's a really obvious kind of starting point, but it's very interesting how those conversations and thoughts and ways of thinking influence what you do as well. And I think my response to this idea of cross sections or insides or line or structure and chaos is kind of definitely influenced by, you know, seeing medical textbooks and diagrams where the body is kind of laid out in front of you as an inside, and seen in a very different way from maybe how I would normally look at it. So that element of kind of inside and outside definitely is something that totally translates in this show and a lot of my work. And you mentioned that as an approach, like inside the gallery. Very much I wanted to feel like kind of being almost being swallowed. You were on the internal perspective and seeing those insides, and then outside the gallery there's this kind of monstrous sculptural form that in maybe another context you'd feel the kind of awareness of its kind of weight and its size, but its placement next to the sea, you have a completely different relationship with it as well. Yeah, I think for me, your comments and that kind of influence of also kind of going around a show, not even my show, like any kind of art show with somebody else, and those conversations are such a useful part of your experience of it as well.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it sort of made me particularly aware of it in this case, how different it is going around an exhibition or show with somebody else from on your own, because that process of sort of exploring a joint response radically changed how I saw it. And I think one of the other things that was very interesting that you were saying just now was this idea of showing things going wrong. I mean, certainly in medicine, you spend a lot of time to begin with learning, at least I did, as a student, and then as a junior doctor, learning how things should be, learning anatomy and then learning normal processes. And then you gradually get a sense of what it looks like when it goes wrong. But when you start operating on people particularly, and you're seeing in reality all these things that you've learnt about, you sometimes, quite often, see the beginning stages of something not being right. You might see an organ that, instead of being bright and glistening and looking healthy, is starting to look diseased, or it's been starved of blood, or it's been injured, or something like that. And so you see in their natural context things that should be one way, but they are in fact another way, either because they're wearing out, or they've got something wrong with them, or whatever it might be. And I suppose we're beginning to see that quite a lot in the world around us. Well, I mean, we always have, I suppose, but increasingly so with all the environmental things that are going on, and the pollution and the sort of degradation of things. And I think that, to me, also came out in your work, that there were things that weren't pristine always. They weren't as you would like to see them. They were as they actually are, and they were mixed up with bits of plastic and bits of God knows what, and you know, that sort of acknowledging that there are discoloured and debased and sort of almost dismembered bits of a picture, which we really have to acknowledge because they're there, and yet very often in representations of these things, those bits are sort of airbrushed out. But in your work, I got that sense that it was there, sort of in all its moods, if you know what I mean. It was sort of looking around these issues, or at least that's how it came across to me, and that particularly came out with your mixture of materials and things. And I'm not sure whether it might be worth, for people listening, Holly, just giving a bit of a sense of what some of these objects are, because to me they were very unusual in that they mixed a number of visual languages.
And I think that's a really good point. But I was also going to say, in response to that, one of the starting points for a lot of the material decisions, as well as the kind of thinking behind the show, was seeing these images and reading about news articles of these hunger stones, that are these rocks that are appearing in the Czech Republic and wider Europe in rivers. People put into the rivers and the water from like the 14th century onwards, really inscribing messages of kind of warning. And so there's a famous one that has now become revealed again, that reads, the inscription translates, "If you see me, weep." And so it's this idea of visibility, of like kind of materials speaking for that. And that was one of it. It really moved me. And I also, in terms of like this idea of slowness, I was thinking about it as a slow siren. And just as you were saying that about, you know, seeing something go wrong again, I was thinking about the sound in hospitals or medical environments, you know, that similar, you know, emergency like sirens that I hear on the road going past my house. I live like right on a busy road, so I constantly hear sirens. And then suddenly when the pandemic hit, there was a stop of that, and you don't, like, what does that stop mean? And it's similarly with like the bleep in hospitals, you know, it's like suddenly if that noise changes, it's a kind of, it's the noise of maybe somebody being unwell but still being monitored, and if that noise changes, it's suddenly that change kind of disrupts something. And yeah, I guess that made me think of your the way you were speaking about it made me think of that in some way.
So I think there's something about those cues in an environment that give you a sense that things are not right, and it's often, I think it's quite, I mean, in the medical context, it's quite difficult to put your finger on what that is sometimes. But I mean, you know, surgically speaking, you might open somebody up and then you just get that feeling that, you know, the organs don't feel right or something like that, and that there's some process that you're not quite sure what it is yet, but it's not right. As a GP, I would often find in a consultation that I would, not at the beginning, I think when I was sort of just beginning to become a bit more skilled at it, but as I became more experienced, I would often get that sense that something just wasn't right. And it's a bit like that sense of the sirens falling silent, or the beep 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 in the background getting faster or slower, or something that you're not consciously aware of to begin with, but it tells you that there's something not right about the environment that you're in. And I got the sense that some of your work was saying something like that there's something not right about some of these processes, or some of these things that should be happening in a particular way over a particular time, but they've either been distorted, or they've been speeded up, or they've been slowed down, or they've been abruptly obstructed, or something like that. And that process of obstruction to a natural process, I think, is one that I'm very much aware of in a clinical sense, and it happens quite quickly. You know, if somebody gets an obstruction to their intestine, then within a few hours they will get severe pain, and their tummy will become distended, and then they'll start to be sick, and if you don't do something about it, they'll die. And that might happen over a few hours or a day or two. Something similar, it seems to me, is happening with landscapes and with the environment more widely, only it's happening in a very different timescale. But that sense of being aware and responding to weak signals, or initially weak signals, of something being out of kilter, is something about needing to have a sympathy with the materials that you're working with. And so your 19th century picture of the inside of the body as a mechanism, you know, with electrical wiring in the brain, and sort of the muscles as levers, and the lungs as pneumatic tubes, and the intestine as tubes. I think that model just simply doesn't work, because it gives a sort of very reductive idea of the complexity of a living environment, whether that's the living environment of a human body, or whether it's the living environment of a seashore, or a set of cliffs, or whatever. And it seemed to me that you were making that point, I thought, that at the moment we're surrounded by complexity and ambiguity, and these weak signals to begin with, that then become much stronger signals of things somehow not being right.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I mean, I guess it's this thing of, it's more complicated than it, but it's also talking about action and consequence as well. And I think you mentioned materials earlier. Like, I think sometimes my sculptures work at the best when they are like on the brink of collapse, or like I use more material, I use unknown materials, or I make strange material combinations because of that kind of unknowingness as well, you know, because of how it enables you to kind of push it or take it in a direction that can almost make the sculptures literally and kind of visually look like you don't know if they're kind of being built up or crumbling away or something as well. And I think, yeah, it's like all like revealing or kind of reappearing or disappearing as well. And yeah, I think I see lots of similarities with that and the landscape as well.
And I think that idea of the brink of collapse is very interesting. Several years ago, I spent some time with a potter called Duncan Houston, who teaches at the University of the Arts, London, and he invited me to take the students from a master's program that I lead, Masters in Education, in Surgical Education, and we went over to his teaching space, and he demonstrated, first of all, throwing a vase, and how he apparently effortlessly thinned out the neck of the vase, and then stopped. And he talked about stopping at that point, of being able to recognize thin materials on the verge of collapse, needing to get it as thin as you possibly could, but no thinner, because if it was any thinner, it would suddenly fall over and collapse. And the surgeons in my group, all surgeons in training, and some of them consultants, at first I think saw this as a bit weird, going over to talk about pottery with pottery students. But when Duncan talked about the thin materials on the verge of collapse, it really made sense, because in surgery too, you're doing an operation on somebody perhaps, and you're learning how to cut out a bit of intestine and put the ends together, say. And the textbooks tell you how to do it. But actually, when you do it, you have to take into account the individuality of that person's organs. And so if you're dealing with a young man of 20 who's perfectly fit and healthy but has had an accident, then it's one thing. If you're dealing with somebody who's 96 and who's diabetic and things, then you just can't pull things without them disintegrating. You have to be very careful. And so recognizing that thin materials on the verge of collapse, and what you can do and what you can't do, and how to take care of the materials you're working with to get the best out of them and put the best into them, but not go beyond that point where you'll cause damage, seems to me to be something that is not, going back to our earlier comments, that's not defined by how many facts you know, or whether you're familiar with biochemical pathways. This is an artistic experience of being able to make an expert judgment about the nature of the materials you're dealing with, whether they're inanimate like clay, or living like intestine, or maybe sort of on the borderline in various ways. But this is an artistic judgment, it seems to me, of what is the nature of the materials you're working with, what is the nature of you as a person interacting with them in that moment, and your state, and then of course the tools and the instruments that you're using to do it. And that seems to me to be something that is just as much a part of surgical practice or laboratory science, I imagine probably engineering too, as it is in working with clay or wood or any of the areas that you're so very skilled at.
Yeah, and I think it's so relevant that you mention pottery as well, because it's one of these examples where I've tried it before, like turning a pot, and I'm shit at it. I can't do it. But that you see somebody do it who can do it and can do it well, like you're speaking about Duncan doing, and it feels like their fingers extend beyond themselves and to the clay. They know it. There's a muscle memory there, or learning it. And I think every one of us who has an experience with using our hands to make things has that with something. Like I think I although I try and experiment with like different materials or push it and rely on not knowing this at all, there's also I go back to metal, I go back to plaster, and I go back to jesmonite when I need structure, when I need form, when I need to stop thinking and just start doing, because you can kind of, it sounds so cheesy, doesn't it, but you kind of you can kind of slightly go beyond that and kind of extend it. And I think that's through knowing a material in a way that you can't kind of intellectualize, you can feel it and you understand it or something as
Yeah, I
well.
think that's right. And when you say you have to stop thinking and start doing, I think it's exactly that, isn't it? You have to reach a point where you kind of respond to these various natures, to the nature of the material you're dealing with, to your own nature, and and make judgments about how all that is behaving in the moment. Because on another day it would be different, because you'll be different and you might be more tired or less tired or hungry or whatever. All those things change all the time. And so I think a big part of I suppose you would say the performance, certainly of medical and scientific practice, and I suspect the performance of artistic practice, is this openness to almost to improvisation, to reading and responding to what's there, and and behaving appropriately, and having to make judgments in the moment and go with them, rather than sticking to a prescribed routine, because that really doesn't work in a complex world where there are so many things changing all the time. But I think that that's something that takes a bit of time certainly time to build up the internal experiences that you then draw on, but I think also time to develop the sort of confidence to relax and say that that's okay to improvise, and not to have planned everything in advance. Because to begin with, certainly in my experience as a medical student, I wanted to know that that I knew everything I needed to know and I could do everything I would be called upon to do. But then later on in my career, I started to become a bit more comfortable with just starting by not saying anything and listening and seeing what came up, and not being too anxious about it. And I wondered if that had parallels for you as an artist in terms of maybe creating things, certainly, but also engaging with other people who respond to your work.
Totally. I mean, the first thing as well, my reference to the Hunger Stone as well, I think is a lot to do with listening instead of doing, or how maybe like questioning how we listen or how we should be listening. A bit of a recalibration of that. But yeah, I mean I've in 2019 I worked with a professor of technical textiles at Huddersfield University when I was making this kind of rubber band sculpture for Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and it was amazing again to have those conversations where you're kind of I'm always just in my studio doing, and then to stop and be in somebody else's space and listen to how they approach it, how they can. I was trying to kind of reuse stuff that I had around, and his approach was you can use anything, you can reuse or reconstitute anything. There's no limits to that. That's your limitations. And I mean, he's got amazing skills and research around doing it, so he can do it very well. But even just listening to those approaches completely changes your attitude to how you then go about your own work. And that work was still the most kind of it was kind of a real weird mix of kind of deep research and total risk of being like when it moved and when we turned it on, it created these static electricity that would electrocute me. So it's this mad but total kind of mix again of like art and science that kind of really naturally emerged from conversations and from listening to other people. And then there's obviously a different kind of listening that's kind of deep listening. And I talk like one of Pauline Oliveros, the composer, is a real influence for me as well, and the way she crawled into a system with her friends and made music from the kind of reverberations of the sound around. And I just think, that idea of like listening to your environment but then having it as like a really physical, tangible thing as a result is really interesting and kind of incredible.
So Holly, can I ask you a bit about your exhibition then, in terms of how much of it you planned in advance and how much of it came into existence as you were making it? Going back to what we were saying just now about responding to the environment and to things that you couldn't predict. Did you I suppose, was it as if you had written a piece of music and written it down in a score, and there it was, and then somebody else played it, or was it something that was more fluid as you were designing it, particularly, I guess, as you were making it for that space at the De La Warr Pavilion?
I mean, looking back now, it feels like it's quite topical that it was a lot of the time. I mean, Rosie will testify for this as well. It was like kind of chewed up and spat out and re-chewed and regurgitated. It was like because of the timings as well. I think the show was initially meant to open in early 2019. I've lost track. Anyway, there's been a lot. It's been a lot of yeah, it's been a lot longer than we thought because of the pandemic, and that has meant that things have shifted and changed because obviously they have to, because the world has. So there's been that element of change as well. But and the space has changed a bit. But actually quite near to when the show started kind of coming into fruition and I was tangibly making stuff, it changed quite dramatically because a local builder had all this sheet material that the entire job had gone basically gone bust because of the pandemic, and he had to be off the site very quick. And there was a weird kind of collection of circumstances that meant he had loads of sheet material that he basically had to scrap or get rid of. And I'd been speaking to him because just seeing them around and making stuff and seeing me covered in plaster and things. And he said, do you want any of it? And I saw it and I was kind of quite horrified by the amount of stuff there was. And I think about it a lot as well. Like I make big sculpture and I'm like worrying about what effect that has, and how hypocritical that is, or how it can help, and all those things. And I was quite horrified by this sheet material and this amount of it. So my initial response was like, no, like, you deal with it. But then it's something that comes up all the time, and so I felt I had to kind of confront. And a way of doing that was also to kind of almost take that material and like lay it out, like spread it out. And so that's the MDF sheeting that you see on the floor and the walls of the gallery space.
Oh, I see. Yes, because I was very struck with that when I first went in there. It has a very powerful effect. So that was something that you hadn't designed from the outset. It was a sort of an opportunity that presented itself, and you recognized it.
Yeah, the idea was always to kind of eat through the architecture, but obviously the show's changed based on the kind of delays to the program, so the eating of the architecture changed quite a lot. But then the MDF came quite late on, as a kind of response as well to that time, and now I think it's after the show it has an onward life. I think it's going to build lots of studios local to the De La Warr as well. So it's kind of this thing that's, and I also, because of the material itself, it felt very relevant because it is like that. It's wood that's been chewed up and kind of rationalized into these sizes that kind of determine the size of our spaces we inhabit as well.
So you mean it's already been transformed a bit?
Yeah. So MDF is pulverized wood and resin, kind of made into this slightly horrible material. But I was amazed at how so I worked with the De La Warr tech team to make the space, and I was amazed how kind of beautiful it became from this initial thing of being quite horrifying and being kind of this icky material. It became something kind of amazing as well when it's laid out. But I still felt that, that immense responsibility for it, of being like, where does all this stuff come from, and where's it going to go afterwards, or like and I think about that quite a lot when I go into galleries and I see big installations. You're like, gosh, what's going to happen to this before and afterwards? Where's it come from? So I guess it goes back to the thing of things coming back again, that idea of,
yes, maybe that sort of cyclical, maybe it's that idea we were talking about at the beginning of transformation and things turning into other things and being transformed and taking on a different shape or a different function or a different meaning, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think that's what can be very exciting about it as well. Like I was wondering if the wood might change, because it obviously it's not designed as a decorative material in any way. It's kind of structural, or it's made as cheaply as possible to just be material, really. So I was interested to see how the light would affect that. You know, you've got such great light coming in that space, in that in the building as well. And I think part of that whole thinking was also seeing the De La Warr itself be kind of transformed by its surroundings. You know, it's like it's kind of being battered by the elements on the coast too. So it's all these, and me and Rosie have spoken about that a lot. You know, this building kind of on the edge as well. So yeah, there's all these kind of elements.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting thinking about the effect of what's been happening over the last year or so on spaces. I mean, you're talking about these completely unpredictable effects on your exhibition of COVID and having to do things differently. And I mean, in a clinical sense, of course, there have been obviously huge disruptions caused by the pandemic. But I think one of the ones that I've become aware of from talking to my GP colleagues, I'm not practicing clinically at the moment myself, but a lot of them are, was that you know, what for me was the focal point of a face-to-face encounter with a patient or with patients, which was being there physically in my consulting room, and people would come into my space and they'd wait outside in the waiting room, and then they'd come in, we'd have a conversation, and then they'd go away and another one would come in. Most of the time, I mean, sometimes I would go and see people at home at that time, but mostly it was around a particular space that I had designed, or had a hand in designing at any rate. And now that's very different, because so much is happening online, and it's happening through technology, and it's happening in different ways. And so a whole lot of things that that used to be so sort of part of everyday experience that you didn't really notice them. You know, how you would pick up small, I don't know, subtleties of somebody's facial expression, or perhaps even what they smelled like, or the sense, the physical sense you had from being in a small space, quite close to them, particularly in a clinical context where you would examine people physically, you know, all that kind of thing, where a lot of those things were suddenly removed. Not all of them, of course, but the relationship between the senses was reconfigured. I think, you know, the role of sight and sound, as opposed to feel and smell and you know, all that kind of thing, radically changed. And I think that has perhaps had more of an effect than we were at first expecting on these human encounters that were built on, that they sort of developed organically from how we've learnt through childhood and beyond to engage with other people, and then all of a sudden things were changed. And I wondered if you felt that those changes affected how people responded to exhibitions and to, you know, physical works of art, particularly sculpture and you know, works like yours.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could comment more on that, because obviously it's also affected how I interact with people and how I'm able to do that as well. Like you'd usually have an opening after the show, and that's when it's a point of kind of, I always find that really interesting, because of my works being quite spatial. You suddenly go from seeing, like, you know, how you maybe see a show in pictures, to suddenly seeing your works with bodies in the space, bodies around it. And there's so much about what I'm interested in and what I try to respond to is about embodiment, or, you know, disembodiment. And so those moments are really kind of exciting to see that form of interaction. And I mean, I've seen it, but it's not happened in the same way, where like there's like, you kind of start to see the way people kind of navigate it or understand it a bit more. So I think I don't know if I can fully comment, because I haven't been able to be there enough. But I think there's something quite interesting happening, and we've been, or maybe you've probably been in hospitals lots, but we've been inside a lot. We've been, you know, in our studios and in our homes, and not really able to be in exhibitions as much. And so you don't get used to those spaces again. And it's, I think, the intimacies or kind of relation with spaces changes very much depending on, like, what, so you've been so used to kind of, again, kind of the augmentation of your body, what you use inside, and then you go to a space that's kind of not your own. And I was thinking about that with the works as well, like what it means to take some. I think it always feels strange taking the work out of the studio and then into a space that like it's not kind of used to, but you see it all together. And suddenly, yeah, it has a whole different meaning. But I'm not sure I can fully. I'm not sure I fully know the answer to it yet. But I think another thing that's relevant to say in relation to that is. Janan, who's the curator at the Delaware as well, mentioned a book that I've now read religiously because it's amazing, by Beatrice Colomina, called X-Ray Architecture, and I was reading it as I was making the works as well, so it's quite influential on some of the sculptures I've made. But she talks about medical science of the time having such a specific effect on our surroundings, like X-rays were the result, were a way to kind of look for tuberculosis, and the cause of those diseases defined the way that architecture needed to be a lot cleaner. Le Corbusier tried to raise it off the ground, and kind of, you know, have things that you could see through, so you couldn't see germs and diseases. And so I think, yeah, what I'm saying is I think it's a very interesting time, because a lot of what I'm doing as well is looking back to the ground or rocks or things that are re-emerging, and kind of trying to figure that out at this moment as well. Which definitely isn't any kind of answer, it's just lots of question marks at the moment.
Yeah,
I think one of the things, sorry Roger, I was just going to say, I think it's been very interesting from our perspective, from the Pavilion perspective. Visitors have been spending a lot more time than usual in the exhibitions, is one of the things that we've heard as a response. And I think it's partly because people want that feeling of being connected in a completely different way. And I think, of course, a lot of the subjects and that you're working with, Holly, in your exhibition are really kind of resonant to now. And I also remember when we were talking about the exhibition a while back, we were also talking about the fact that the Delaware Pavilion was part funded by the Ministry of Health to begin with. And I think that sense of, you know, Beatrice Colomina, of course, identifying the sort of the sort of recovery advice around the post-tuberculosis pandemic, and the sort of spaciousness, airiness, those kinds of qualities of modernist architecture. I think that's something that we're feeling again from the pavilion's visitors, just the desire to be in a space that feels airy, that's next to the sea as well. But again, as you've said, the kind of troubled location that we have, which is also you know, the Delaware Pavilion is likely to be underwater in the next 100 years, I would say, in part. You know, there's kind of climate maps that talk about areas of the pavilion being around the pavilion being subject to regular flooding by 2050. So I think this place to think through a lot of those conditions and ideas of your exhibition are really ideal. And I just want to wrap things up. Sorry, we can edit this out, but I just want, because we've been talking for a while, and I think, you know, we could go on for a really long time as well. But I just wanted to invite both of you to make any final reflections before we come to a close. About anything at all.
Well, can I say something about what you've just said, Rosie? Because it seems to me that that we tend to think, at least I tend to think, of exhibitions particularly in terms of the content of the exhibition and then being in a place that seems to be permanent and unchanging. It's usually a gallery or whatever it might be. And although that may not be the case, that's how it kind of seems. And I think that there's a parallel with when you're dealing with people clinically, and you deal with a person in that moment, and you see them the next day and they look pretty much the same, and you kind of have a framework of things being almost static in terms of the framework within which what you're doing takes place. But I think what you were saying about the Delaware Pavilion, you know, part of it not being there in 50 years, that the fact that it is itself inevitably going to change, and that's just a part of what happens, sort of brings into sharp focus something that of course is there all the time with everything, but we often don't notice it. And I think that, you know, sometimes disease has that effect in speeding up natural processes of things starting to dissolve or go wrong or whatever. But when there is a disease, you see that happening in much more quickly, and in a time frame where you are aware of change happening. And I think that maybe I think about the contents of exhibitions, as particularly temporary exhibitions, as being something that's set up and then it's there for 3 months and then it goes away. But I hadn't really thought about that as affecting the space within which those exhibitions take place. And what you were saying about everything being impermanent and being transient and being mutable and all those things, seemed to me that the Delaware is a particularly interesting one for this exhibition of Holly's work, because the exhibition objects a lot of them are about transformation and change and inconstancy and things, and so is the environment. But you need to have that pointed out to you, as you've just done, about the environment. Otherwise you might not have noticed, because it happens at a slightly, although not all that much slower speed.
I think as well, just to add to that, Roger, there's that idea of change, and maybe to end on a positive note as well. That's like that aspect of, you know, constant change. We've been talking about, you know, in environmental issues and disease and stuff, but there's also these moments of, like, you know, undoing and redoing, which I was really focusing on with this kind of symbol of the worm as something that's, you know, a tool for kind of changing this big kind of pile of question marks that we've got. Like, what can you kind of gather from it, and what can we redo? And so that idea of, you know, kind of constant change is something that I find very it's kind of scary, but also kind of uplifting in some ways as well. I think there's different ways to look at it, and definitely something that I try and I will try to kind of bring to the forefront a bit, like, you know, asking questions always. How do you continue to ask questions when everything's moving around all the time?
Yeah, I think that's the crucial thing, is continuing to engage with things and ask questions. I didn't mean to be negative about it, because I think that these they can be very exciting, can't they? And they lead to sort of development and maturation and all sorts of new ideas and all kinds of things happening, and being open to change. But that bringing that into awareness, I think, circling back to where we began this conversation, I think having that awareness of the environment that you're in and the work that you do, I think that very often is a kind of artistic sensibility, and that sort of recognition of the intersection between yourself and your body and your instruments and the tools and the materials that you're working with and the environment and the setting. All those things come together in a way that is just as important in the scientific world as it is in the world of the visual or the plastic or the performing arts. And so I really do go back to this idea that I think that this is a toxic and artificial, it's a false dichotomy. And I think that the kind of work that you're both doing, I think, Rosie, in framing the Delaware Pavilion in that way, and Holly, the work that you're doing in sort of populating that with thought-provoking ideas, to me they're all part of the same thing, really, and they link very strongly with how I see things from my background in the world of science and medicine.
It's very clever to bring it in a full circle when speaking about loops.
Exactly, and I think that makes it a really perfect moment to stop our conversation and just to thank you both